We set out some objectives pretty quickly, and I was bought in on the ticket of change in that sense. So firstly, driving gender diversity. It probably won't come as any massive surprise that in Fidelity, much like most city-based finance companies, it's gender diversity is a real struggle. Both in terms of the reality of bringing people in, which is obviously what we're focusing on, but also just the external pressure gathering more and more around that piece. We also needed to increase the acceptance rate. So we had a real issue, and this is backed up by some research that we got through a company called Trendance, that basically says that the hierarchy of industries for the students that we were looking at goes investment banking, consulting, asset management. So when we looked at the profile of the type of students that we'll attract on campus, we're third in the list of industries that those people want to work for, which really translated into some negative acceptance rates. We had something slightly lower than 50% of our offers accepted in the first season that I was responsible for at Fidelity, which was, it's soul destroying because the nature of the work, and anyone that works in early careers, I'm sure, will have gone through this, but you have fairly quiet periods where you can be a bit more strategic and you have casual conversations in bars with your friends about how it's really challenging to hire the best talent and blah, blah, blah. And then all of a sudden September rolls around and you stare at your desk for 4 months and then you wake up and it's the new year, and that's kind of the nature of the ebb and flow of it. So, to have gone through that really intense period, particularly in a new company for me at the time, it's just brutal if half of the people that you're offering then say, no thanks, we've got a job at the investment bank down the road, We wanted to improve retention, and I've said this already, but I'm now going into my second season with Fidelity, so I don't want to spoil the punchline too much, but the improving retention piece is yet to be seen. But what I can say is that we had a pretty poor retention rate for our grads over a 2 to 3 year period, way lower than our competitors, and it presented as a real issue when we talked about increasing our grad hiring numbers or intern hiring numbers, because the return on investment just wasn't there from a business perspective. So it was quite challenging. And then global consistency as well, because the business has grown fairly organically. Which is great, and you meet lots of interesting people and there's lots of local variances, but actually it presents real challenges when you're looking at moving people internationally and what people's expectations of the roles are, or even, frankly, just properly mapping out what jobs we have and where, which seems to be a moving target. So in terms of the actual solution then, and you've obviously heard lots about how this is done, so I don't want to labour that too much. But the challenges that we had when it came to introducing a strength solution, as I said, we didn't have a really robust competency model in place at the time. We didn't even have that, unfortunately. So it wasn't like saying to our stakeholders, what we do currently, it's like that, but slightly better. We just, it was really starting from scratch. So the design process was a huge challenge, because what as I alluded to in the first slide, we've broken it down into the investment side of the business and the commercial side of the business. Obviously, the businesses that operate within those two umbrellas don't see themselves as being similar. They see themselves as being radically different. So the notion of going to a director of research in equities and saying, "Hey, Ned, that's an actual guy, I didn't make it up. We're gonna put you in a room with Marty, also an actual guy in fixed income, and we'll find a solution that works for both of you." And they were thinking, well, but our jobs are completely different. They don't even sound the same. So, that was really difficult to try and put things under a common umbrella that was actually a workable solution, because we've talked a lot about, or not a lot, but there's been some discussion about the cost of implementing a huge overarching solution, and one of the ways to do that is to try and bring things under a common umbrella, so there aren't too many nuances through the process, which is why, by the way, I was quizzing you about the different stages of the assessment process, so apologies for that. So design process was one of them. Incredibly tight time frames. So we met with the guys from CAP. I'd had a bit of experience with strengths in a previous organisation and was quite keen to see if we could use it as a model for Fidelity. And I thought that we'd probably, we'd get through a season, we'd probably have a year's worth of discussion and design and then implement it for the following season. The stakeholders were won over much more significantly than I was anticipating. And within 7 months, we'd gone from nothing at all to a complete end-to-end solution. That's everything from the online application piece right through to the assessment centre stage. This is a really, really tight turnaround. And obviously that presents challenges in terms of making sure that it's right and making sure that stakeholders are properly bought in, etc. The entrenched views, I mean, this plays into the process design piece, but people had very, very strong views. And I spoke to a couple of people about this at the beginning of the conference, but there's a difference between what people feel they should be doing and saying. So, for example, wanting a greater level of cognitive diversity and making sure that we had people that weren't just Oxbridge students that we would traditionally hire, more than any other. But then when it came to the assessment centres, those same individuals would say, well, it just seems odd that we don't have more Oxbridge students. That's all. I would have liked to have seen some more. There's some really, and knowing that there's a duality between what people say and what they really feel is probably something in retrospect I should have paid more attention to. And also global stakeholders as well. So we were looking at a solution that was sustainable and fit for purpose in all of our locations as much as was possible at the time. And so, paying a good level of attention to the cultural differences in some of our locations, namely Hong Kong and even more so mainland China versus the UK. I mean, it's just a very different type of conversation. And again, we didn't have anything really consistent in process at all to start with. And so the way that you approach those conversations, some people are just a lot more adverse to change than others. And I thought I had a pretty rough ride at first in the UK. And then I spoke to some of the folk out in mainland China, and I realized that I had it easy in the UK, and it was actually, it's much more challenging in other locations. So on we went with the success analysis piece. So this is where we were determining the set of strengths that we ultimately decided were those best capable of predicting someone's value to the organisation in the future. The success analysis piece was absolutely instrumental in getting people over the line in terms of stakeholders, I mean. What became evident is that in order to capture the attention or even the imagination of the stakeholder group that we were working with, and they're highly numerate individuals, we needed a lot of numerical data. We needed some stats that we could go back with and say, look, this is where we are. This is what we need, And so we conducted a series of surveys, and all of the data came back as numbers, and that helped. But once we had their attention, we also needed to make sure that we had a narrative, to get them over the line, to kind of win them over, to help them feel like they were a part of the process and it wasn't something that was being done to them. So having a mix of quantitative and qualitative research was a really valuable tool, and it was something that we could go back to again and again. So the solution, as I said, it was end-to-end in our case. So we had, you'll have to forgive the semantics because we just used terms that worked for us as an organisation. The first was the Photobook. So we went from having a very subjective online application form which consisted of 3 essay questions. The essay questions were completely unrelated to the business. I accept no responsibility for this, by the way. This was there before I was. But my favourite one of those questions was, what is your favourite piece of music or book, and why? And that was one of the questions by which we assessed the quality of a candidate in an investment management role. So it was good fun. So we changed that one around, and I'm going to show you a clip in just a moment in fact, I'll show you it now. This is the introductory video. So as an applicant to any of our early careers programs, they would they would go online to this one online assessment. So rather than having, 2 or 3 assessment providers, one for a numerical test, one for a reasoning test, whatever, we would just have this one solution. So the photo book, then the next stage of the process was a video interview, and this is really common practice at the moment. But the point is that the CAP team delivered basically a bank of strengths questions. So against the 12 or so strengths that we identified, we had a bank of questions, so several questions for each of them, and we used some of those questions for the video interviewing stage, some for the face-to-face interview stage, and then a further bank went into the assessment centre stage. But the key thing beyond the scripts that we got is in the assessment, this sort of new piece here, this micro exercise step, which now forms part of the assessment centre. So if anyone's had experience with assessment centres, they're fairly, I've found at least, they tend to be fairly formulaic. You've got an interview or two with ideally someone senior from the business or the business area that the candidate might be going into. You'll have some sort of an in-tray exercise with a vast amount of data that they can't possibly read in the amount of time that you give them, and then you put them in a very stressful one-to-one sort of intense conversation and then quiz them on what tiny amount of information they've been able to retain. And then you might put them in a sort of fairly ambiguous group exercise. I think the very first one that I ran when I first started in this line of work about 10 years ago or so was about building a school in Mozambique. And at the time I was trying to hire business consultants, so it's quite far removed from what we were doing. The micro exercises are a really interesting and quite novel way of drilling down into the strengths that we've identified. So, we've got, if we have a list of 12 strengths, at each stage of the process we're asking questions around those strengths, but in the assessment centre the key is that we're trying to not only ask questions around those strengths but also observe them in practice. And the micro exercise allows us to, and these, we have 3 and they last around 15 or 20 minutes each. And the idea is that because they're so brief, you get a very authentic output from the candidate because they don't have time to overthink it. You don't have that group exercise type scenario where they go in thinking, well, I'm going to be the leader, I'm going to be the facilitator, I'm going to be the note taker, and they don't have all of that sort of training in advance to kind of cope with those situations. It's a very kind of raw exercise where they read some material and they have to respond quickly. And so we can review 2 strengths per micro exercise in a way that you can't really do effectively in a bigger group exercise type scenario. The candidate, I suppose, experience piece is that they come in there through the photo book, and one of the things, and this wasn't even really an objective, but is a kind of positive side effect of the solution that we introduced, is that we saw a massive increase in the number of candidates actually completing the application process. We lost more than half of the candidates just on the online assessment piece alone with the steps that we previously had in place, whereas the significant majority, they weren't of course all successful, but the significant majority actually went through all of the testing stage, which is great because it gave us such a richer pool of candidates to then bring forward to the next stage. Video interview, there's lots of mixed feedback from candidates around this, but I think the fact that you're asking slightly interesting strengths-based questions, in my mind at least, it's better than going through a more traditional competency type methodology because, it's boring for the candidates. Frankly, it's boring for the assessors. It's very well practiced. In fact, I used to do the odd guest lecture at universities to teach students how to answer the perfect competency-based question, and then I'd invite them to apply to the company, and then I'd try and assess them. It's ludicrous, really. I was giving them the answer before, but that was the nature of it. And then obviously the assessment centre piece, which had other elements, many of the common elements of assessment centres, but also those micro exercises. For the stakeholders, they were absolutely involved in the success analysis piece, so they were key to that. But then from that, we had this raft of questions, which we then obviously cross-referenced with the business as well. So we made sure that they were happy with all of the questions and how they related to the strengths and so on. So the output, I suppose, from it, and you know, I think I said this the last time I gave this presentation, but I was so pleased with the gender diversity stats, particularly on the investment side of the business. 62% across our intern and graduate cohort for the investment business are female. And the industry average is about 21%. And we were below that. We were around 17. So, and you know, 50% hires, female hires overall, which is great. 85% offers accepted, so that's up from, you know, as I say, just below 50